Here's a short, powerful hook for your story, asterisk, he said I meant nothing, then why was I the one he let go? Asterisk it's punchy, emotionally charged, and instantly sparks curiosity, perfect for a YouTube thumbnail or the first 5 seconds of your video. If you want, I can also craft 3-5 alternative hooks that are equally compelling and YouTube optimized. Do you want me to do that? The memory of that day never leaves him. It wasn't marked by a dramatic argument or a storm of words, it was a quiet, almost imperceptible ending, a soft departure that still echoes in his chest. He remembers standing there, the sunlight slanting through the cafe window, catching the warm chestnut highlights in her hair. She moved with that effortless grace she always carried, the kind that made ordinary gestures, reaching for her coffee cup, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, feel like poetry. He remembers the way she looked at him that day, her eyes calm but distant, carrying a weight he couldn't read. He had wanted to speak, to ask why, to stop her from leaving, but the words stuck in his throat. All he managed was a small, hesitant smile that he now realizes must have seemed fragile, insignificant, and she had returned it with a polite tilt of her lips before stepping back. And then, the brush of her hand. It was brief, almost nothing, just the tip of her fingers grazing his shoulder as she passed by. Yet he remembers it with painful clarity, the warmth, the fleeting pressure, the way it lingered in his memory long after she was gone. There was a rhythm to that moment, subtle, almost teasing, as if the universe had allowed him one last connection before drawing her away. He had felt her pulse there, steady and quiet, and the scent of her perfume, a soft, floral trace, hovered in the air, embedding itself in his senses. He watched her leave, the distance between them growing with each step, and felt a hollow weight settle in his chest. The world around him continued as usual, the clatter of coffee cups, the low hum of conversation, but he might as well have been alone in a silent room. There was no dramatic door slam, no shouted confession of feelings, just the soft click of the door closing behind her, carrying with it the quiet finality of her absence. Later, he would replay that moment countless times. Why had she left? Did it mean nothing to her? Was he simply expendable in a life she had carefully arranged? The questions haunted him because, in truth, he could feel that it had meant something, every fleeting smile, every unspoken glance, every subtle brush of hands, but she had chosen to let go, and he was left holding the invisible threads. Even now, months later, the memory is alive, tactile. He can feel the faint warmth of her hand on his shoulder, the subtle fragrance lingering in his mind, the gentle grace in her movements that left him suspended between admiration and longing. It was a goodbye without words, yet it spoke volumes, about unspoken regrets, emotional courage, and the ache of something left unfinished. And in that quiet, unassuming farewell, he realizes that what he feels is not bitterness, but the first, aching awareness that some losses are measured not in loud drama, but in the tender, unforgettable weight of what could have been. The day they crossed paths again was ordinary in every sense, yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. He had stepped into the little bookstore, the familiar smell of old pages and polished wood greeting him like an old friend, when he saw her. She was there, standing in the sunlight that spilled through the tall windows, reaching for a book on the top shelf. Even in casual clothing, she carried an effortless elegance, the soft curve of her neck as she stretched, the subtle arch of her back, the calm focus in her eyes. Time seemed to slow, and for a moment, he wondered if this was a memory replaying itself, rather than reality. She hadn't noticed him yet, and that gave him a few seconds to drink her in. The lines on her face, so delicate yet telling, spoke of years of experience and quiet resilience. Her hair fell loosely over her shoulders, catching the light in a way that reminded him of that fleeting morning months ago, the one he could never forget. There was a kind of serene confidence in her presence now, different from the fleeting vulnerability he remembered. She seemed both distant and close at the same time, a contradiction he found impossible to resist. Then it happened, a brush of hands. She reached for the same worn copy of poetry he had been eyeing, their fingers meeting for a heartbeat. The contact was accidental, brief, yet it sent a quiet jolt through him, awakening every memory of their last touch. He felt the warmth of her skin, soft yet firm, the faint pressure of her fingertips, and the subtle pulse of life under her touch. He looked into her eyes, and there was a flicker of recognition there, a silent acknowledgement that both of them remembered, both of them felt. Neither spoke immediately. The air between them was thick with unspoken questions. How have you been? Why did things end? Did you think of me? He noticed the slight hesitation in her posture, the gentle tension in her shoulders, and realized she, too, carried the weight of that past goodbye. He felt a strange mix of relief and longing, relief that she was here, tangible, real, and longing for the closeness they had once shared, now reframed by time and experience. Her scent drifted subtly, floral but grounded, faintly lingering in the air like a memory. He remembered the last time it had touched him, the quiet ache it had left. The brief connection of their hands seemed to awaken that same ache, but this time it was paired with a possibility, a chance to rebuild, to explore, to understand. Finally, she smiled, a soft curve of her lips, polite yet warm. It was a small gesture, almost casual, but it carried the weight of acknowledgement, of shared history, of doors slightly reopened. And in that simple exchange, he realized that the collision of their worlds, two lives separated by time, experience, and unspoken truths, was no accident. It was the start of something tentative, fragile, and quietly electric. As he watched her walk away, the book now in her hands, he felt a surge of anticipation. Something was stirring between them, subtle but undeniable. The air seemed charged with possibility, every small movement, every glance, every accidental brush of hands carrying the silent promise of a connection that refused to fade. They found themselves in the quiet corner of a small cafe, the kind with soft lighting and the faint smell of roasted coffee beans lingering in the air. It wasn't planned, yet neither seemed eager to leave. Across the table, she stirred her tea absent-mindedly, the spoon clinking softly against the porcelain cup. He watched her, noticing the subtle curve of her shoulders, the delicate movement of her fingers as they wrapped around the cup, and felt the familiar pull of something he had tried to bury. Conversation began cautiously, almost stilted, as if each word carried the weight of unspoken history. She spoke first, her voice calm, measured, yet there was a hint of vulnerability underneath, a tremor he could hear only because he was listening, truly listening, in a way he hadn't before. He responded carefully, his words revealing just enough of himself to invite trust, to show that he, too, was not invincible. Small confessions surfaced. He spoke of sleepless nights and lingering regrets, of moments when he wondered if letting her go had been his greatest mistake. She admitted to similar thoughts, quiet doubts that had shadowed her days, fears of being too guarded, too careful. Their words, simple yet intimate, began to bridge the distance that had grown between them. Every pause, every lingering glance, spoke as loudly as the sentences themselves. The tension wasn't just emotional, it was physical, subtle and unavoidable. He noticed the way her knee brushed lightly against his under the table, a fleeting touch that made his pulse quicken. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and he found himself mesmerized by the motion, the softness of the hair sliding across her fingers. When she laughed at a small joke, he leaned slightly closer, drawn in by the warmth and melody of her voice. It wasn't just attraction, it was recognition, a deep familiarity that neither time nor distance could erase. At one point, she rested her hand lightly on his forearm while making a point, the warmth of her skin transferring through the thin fabric of his sleeve. He felt it, a steady, grounding presence that reassured and unsettled him all at once. Their eyes met, held for a heartbeat too long, and in that brief contact, both acknowledged the tension they had been dancing around for months. The cafe's ambient noise seemed to fade, leaving only the rhythm of their breathing and the gentle brush of their movements. He realized how much he had missed these small, human moments, the subtle tilt of her head when she listens, the way her lips part slightly as she thinks, the quiet sincerity in her gaze. She, too, seemed to notice him differently now, not just as a younger man in her past, but as someone capable of understanding, of sharing, of caring deeply. By the time they left, the afternoon sunlight was dipping low, casting long shadows on the street. Neither spoke of the lingering feelings directly, but the warmth between them was undeniable, a soft hum of connection that promised more. They walked side by side, the occasional accidental brush of hands sparking subtle jolts of anticipation. It was a beginning, quiet, fragile, and full of potential, built on shared vulnerability and the slowly blossoming trust that neither had dared to feel before. Time seemed to move differently when they were together. It wasn't the grand gestures or dramatic confessions that drew him in, it was the quiet, almost imperceptible moments that lingered far longer than they should. They had begun spending more time together, helping each other with small tasks, sharing errands, or simply walking through the city streets in the late afternoon, sunlight painting the sidewalks gold. Every step, every accidental brush, felt heavier than its weight in memory. A simple touch became a language of its own. When she reached to steady a wobbly chair, his hand brushed hers lightly. The contact was fleeting, almost casual, yet it sent warmth climbing his arm and a subtle electricity he could not ignore. He noticed the texture of her skin, soft yet firm, the pulse of life beneath her fingers that seemed to echo his own. He wanted to linger, to let his fingers follow the path of hers just a moment longer, but social caution restrained him. And yet, the moment remained, suspended between familiarity and something more. Their eyes spoke in ways words could not. During conversations, her gaze would linger just a second too long, on his lips when he spoke, on the corners of his eyes when he smiled. It was a careful observation, respectful, yet intimate, and it left him unsettled and captivated all at once. He caught himself imagining the stories behind those looks, wondering if she felt the same subtle pull, the same quiet longing he carried. Even the smallest details became imbued with meaning. He noticed the faint warmth of her scarf brushing against his sleeve when they stood side by side. The scent of her perfume, a delicate floral mix with hints of something woody and grounded, trailed after her, wrapping around him unexpectedly, making him inhale a little too deeply, memorizing the fragrance as though it were a part of her he could hold on to. When she brushed her hair back from her face, the movement seemed almost choreographed for him, a silent gesture that made his heart twist with anticipation. Yet the physicality remained careful, deliberate, respectful, never overstepping boundaries, always safe, always YouTube-friendly. Fingers occasionally met, arms brushed lightly while walking, shoulders nudged in jest or support. Each touch was meaningful, intentional, yet restrained, a dance of closeness that neither wanted to rush. They were learning the language of each other's bodies, the rhythm of proximity and distance, and in that slow, deliberate communication, the tension mounted. By the evening, when they would pause at a street corner, sharing a quiet laugh or a comment about the passing crowd, there would be those moments, those lingering glances where time seemed to stretch, where each held the other's look just a heartbeat longer than necessary. It was in these subtle exchanges that desire and hesitation intertwined, creating a tension that was both tantalizing and comforting. Walking home, the occasional accidental hand brush became more intentional, a soft nudge, a touch that lasted a fraction longer. They were learning to speak without words, to convey warmth, reassurance, and unspoken longing through gestures small enough to be unnoticed by the world but immense in the privacy of their shared space. The slow burn was building, and neither could deny it. Every subtle touch, every lingering glance, was drawing them closer, emotionally and physically, towards something undeniable. The closeness they had been cultivating slowly began to reveal the walls they each carried. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet tension, a moment where lingering fears collided with undeniable desire. They were sharing a late afternoon in the park, the golden sunlight filtering through leaves, when a small misunderstanding arose, perhaps a misread comment or a delayed response, and it sparked an undercurrent of doubt. He noticed the subtle shift immediately, the way her shoulders tensed, the slight tightening of her jaw, the way her eyes, usually so soft and inviting, became guarded. He felt his own chest tighten, a quiet mirror of her restraint, as he realized the depth of the fear that had kept them both distant for so long. For a moment, he wondered if all the closeness they had built might unravel because of one small misstep. They sat on a bench, the space between them charged yet careful. He chose his words slowly, knowing the balance between honesty and intrusion was delicate. "I've thought about that day, when you left," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. I didn't understand why, and I still think about it sometimes. She looked down, her fingers tracing patterns on the worn wood of the bench. The sunlight caught the faint lines at the corner of her eyes, the gentle creases that hinted at years of both laughter and sorrow. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but firm, tinged with a vulnerability she rarely showed. I was afraid, she admitted, the confession slipping out like a whisper she hadn't intended to share. Afraid of being hurt again, afraid of letting someone in too close. Her hand moved, lightly resting on his forearm, almost instinctively. The warmth of her skin against his sent a ripple through him, steady, grounding, intimate. He felt the subtle pulse of her wrist beneath his fingers and the quiet steadiness of her presence, and it struck him how much power a single, deliberate touch could hold. He responded by keeping his hand close to hers, careful not to press, but unwilling to let go. For a while, neither spoke, and the silence was full of meaning. The rustle of leaves, distant laughter of children, the faint hum of the city beyond the park, they all faded into the background, leaving only the subtle symphony of two people confronting the walls they had built around their hearts. Hesitation, fear, longing, all coexisted in that quiet pause, and in that coexistence lay the turning point of their connection. Finally, he whispered, almost to himself, "I don't want to let you go again." The words were simple, yet charged with months of regret, hope, and longing. She lifted her gaze, eyes glistening in the dappled sunlight, and for the first time, allowed herself to fully meet his look. There was acknowledgement there, of fear, yes, but also of the quiet desire to trust, to lean in, to bridge the space between them. It was a pivotal moment. Their emotional walls had not fully crumbled, but cracks had appeared, letting warmth, understanding, and connection seep through. It was in these moments of careful honesty and deliberate touch that their slow-burn tension intensified, proof that love, though hesitant and fragile, could flourish when two hearts were brave enough to confront the truths they had hidden from the world, and from themselves. The evening had settled into a gentle calm, the city lights flickering like distant stars, and they found themselves walking along a quiet street, side by side. The air carried a soft chill, and he could see her breath forming faint clouds, delicate and fleeting. There was a comfort in the silence between them, a shared rhythm of steps that felt intimate without needing words. Yet beneath that calm, a tension hummed, an unspoken desire, a longing that neither dared to voice fully, until now. They paused at a small park, the benches bathed in the soft glow of a single lamp. She looked up at him, her expression open yet guarded, the faintest shadow of hesitation lingering in her eyes. He took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the months they had spent circling each other, building closeness through subtle touches, shared moments, and lingering glances. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady, as if every word carried the careful honesty he had been holding back. "I've thought about you, more than I probably should," he admitted. "More than I realized I could." His fingers brushed against the edge of her hand, hesitant, almost tentative. He felt the warmth radiating from her skin, the subtle pulse beneath her touch. It wasn't bold or forceful, just deliberate enough to bridge the space between them, to show that he was present, that he cared, that he wanted this connection to matter. She smiled softly, a quiet, almost shy curve of her lips, and he noticed the way her eyes glistened in the lamplight. "I've felt the same," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. Her hand moved closer, resting lightly against his forearm, the warmth spreading, grounding him. Every small movement, the gentle tilt of her head, the way her fingers lingered, spoke volumes, more than words ever could. The tension that had simmered for months began to shift, transforming into a tender intimacy. He reached out, letting his hand hover near hers before finally brushing his fingers against hers. The contact was brief, tentative, yet electric. He felt her respond instinctively, her hand pressing slightly, as if to confirm the silent agreement between them. They were here, together, and it was safe to feel, to lean in, to let go of hesitation, if only a little. They stood in that quiet park, side by side, letting the silence speak, letting the small touches and shared breaths communicate what neither could have said months ago. He felt the gentle rise and fall of her shoulders, the warmth of her presence seeping into his own, and realized that these quiet confessions, these subtle gestures, were more intimate than any grand declaration. Finally, she leaned just slightly closer, her head brushing his shoulder. He felt the weight of her trust, the softness of her hair against his sleeve, and the quiet heartbeat that seemed to match his own. In that moment, words became unnecessary. Everything they had felt, everything they had held back, was being spoken through touch, through presence, through the shared recognition that neither wanted to be apart again. By the time they walked away from the lamplit park, their hands brushed deliberately, fingers entwining naturally. The slow burn had reached its emotional peak, not with a dramatic confession, but with a quiet, steady acknowledgement. They belonged to this moment, to each other, and to the trust and warmth they had cultivated together. The days that followed felt different, lighter, yet charged with a quiet joy he had not expected. Their lives, once running parallel but separate, now began to intertwine in subtle, meaningful ways. It wasn't a sudden leap into grand declarations or dramatic gestures, it was in the small moments, the everyday shared experiences, that they found themselves truly together. They spent mornings in soft conversation over coffee, the clink of cups and the aroma of roasted beans becoming the backdrop of their easy intimacy. He noticed how she laughed at his small jokes, a sound warm and melodic, and how her eyes softened when she spoke about her day. Every glance, every subtle movement, became a thread weaving them closer. When she brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, his fingers instinctively followed, pausing just an inch from hers, and she let them linger there, a silent acknowledgement of closeness. Evenings were for slow walks through familiar streets, where the world seemed to pause for them. Her hand would occasionally brush against his arm, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by accident, but each touch carried the weight of connection. He felt the warmth radiating from her presence, grounding him, reminding him that this was real, that the tension and longing of months past had blossomed into something steady and nurturing. They learned the beauty of shared silences, too. Sitting side by side on a park bench, she would rest her head lightly against his shoulder. He felt the cadence of her breathing, the gentle rise and fall of her chest against his own. The world beyond them, the distant hum of traffic, the flickering streetlights, the faint rustle of leaves, became a muted backdrop to their quiet togetherness. In these moments, words were unnecessary, touch, presence, and shared understanding spoke louder than anything spoken aloud. There were still moments of reflection, gentle reminders of the distance they had once endured. He thought about the day she had walked away, the unspoken farewell that had haunted him. But now, standing beside her, feeling her warmth, he realized that the pain of that past had been necessary. It had shaped the depth of their connection, made them both more aware, more patient, more appreciative of the fragile, beautiful intimacy they now shared. As time passed, the age gap between them, once a quiet shadow of hesitation, became simply a part of who they were, two lives with different experiences, perspectives, and histories, now merging into a shared present. They respected one another's boundaries, supported each other's dreams, and found comfort in the predictability of small routines made extraordinary simply by being together. One evening, she rested her head on his shoulder, fingers brushing gently against his, and he could feel her heartbeat, steady, calm, confident in its closeness. He pressed his cheek lightly against hers, savoring the soft warmth of her presence, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a complete sense of belonging. The slow burn, the careful touches, the lingering glances, and quiet confessions had all led to this, an emotional intimacy that was patient, tender, and enduring. They didn't need grand gestures to prove their love, it lived in the rhythm of their breaths, the gentle weight of hands held, and the quiet understanding that neither would let go again. In this acceptance, in this togetherness, they found a love that was steady, safe, and profoundly theirs.